Financial markets around the world are trembling once more. But this time, the turbulence isn't being triggered by central bank interest rate decisions or mounting sovereign debt concerns. Instead, panic is spreading through Washington's corridors of power before any dramatic policy shift has even materialized. At the center of this anxiety stands Scott Bessent, America's newly appointed Treasury Secretary, who finds himself in an increasingly awkward position, publicly retreating from former President Trump's aggressive promise to slap China with tariffs as high as 100%. What's happening behind closed doors tells a far more revealing story than the official statements suggest. The uncomfortable truth is this: the United States can no longer afford to engage in another full-scale economic confrontation with Beijing. For generations, American policymakers have grown accustomed to wielding the dollar as their ultimate weapon, controlling the arteries through which global capital flows. But the landscape has fundamentally transformed. Today, it's China that maintains an iron grip on the raw materials that make contemporary technology possible. The rare earth elements, the specialized magnets, the advanced battery components that power everything from military defense systems to electric vehicles rolling off Tesla's assembly lines. Beijing hasn't even begun to seriously restrict the flow of these critical resources yet. And still, Washington is already feeling the squeeze. As financial markets experience temporary rallies fueled by speculation about a possible détente between the two superpowers, one fundamental question continues to hang in the air. Who actually holds the reins of power in this relationship? This confrontation extends far beyond the mechanics of tariff schedules or bilateral trade statistics. At its core, this is a struggle over global influence, and the evidence increasingly suggests that power is rapidly shifting away from the institutions that have long been anchored to the American dollar. The data points we'll examine in this investigation may challenge everything you thought you understood about the current balance of global economic power. So stay with us through to the conclusion. The numbers paint a picture that very few people are prepared to see. When Donald Trump first announced his intention to impose blanket tariffs of 100% on virtually all products manufactured in China, observers around the globe prepared themselves for unprecedented economic disruption. Trade experts warned of cascading consequences. Supply chains would collapse. Consumer prices would skyrocket. International cooperation would fracture beyond repair. But rather than following through on this explosive threat, something unexpected happened. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent embarked on what can only be described as a diplomatic rehabilitation tour. News cameras tracked his movements from financial centers in London to policy forums in Seoul, and everywhere he went, Bessent delivered variations on the same carefully crafted message. China represents a malign force in the global economy and must face consequences for deliberately weaponizing its control over essential supply chains. This confrontation, he told audiences repeatedly, isn't just America versus China. This is China standing against the rest of the civilized world. He pointed to Beijing's recent announcements regarding tighter export controls on strategic materials, restrictions scheduled to take effect within weeks, and insisted that Washington had mounted an aggressive pushback campaign. The rhetoric sounded strikingly familiar. In fact, it was nearly identical to the language that former Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen employed throughout 2023 and into 2024, when Washington's primary complaint centered on what it termed Chinese industrial overcapacity. During that earlier phase of tension, the narrative focused heavily on an alleged flood of subsidized Chinese electric vehicles and underpriced steel overwhelming global markets. Now the script has been updated, but the underlying accusation remains unchanged. This time the focus has shifted to rare earth elements, the specialized metals that serve as the essential building blocks for semiconductors, precision-guided weapon systems, and electric motor components. Bessent's stern warnings came on the heels of a significant but relatively quiet American escalation. Washington had discreetly raised import duties on a range of Chinese products to levels as high as 145%. The impact was immediate and dramatic. Throughout April and extending into May of 2025, Chinese exports of rare earth materials to the United States experienced a catastrophic collapse, plummeting by more than 60% compared to the previous period. The sudden disruption sent shockwaves rippling through American technology firms and defense contractors who had grown dependent on these materials. Yet Beijing never actually sealed off the supply entirely. While shipments to the United States dried up, deliveries to other destinations, India, Vietnam, Thailand, and even Germany, continued flowing without significant interruption. Within approximately 30 days, export volumes had largely returned to normal levels, though notably the United States remained on the outside looking in. This demonstrated something crucial about how Beijing has refined its retaliation strategy. China wasn't interested in creating a global crisis that would harm everyone equally. Instead, Chinese policymakers wanted to ensure that Washington felt isolated pressure while the rest of the world continued operating normally. As American procurement officers desperately searched for alternative suppliers, China's state-controlled processing facilities methodically redirected their distribution networks. New commercial agreements were signed across Southeast and South Asia. Each ton of rare earth oxides and compounds sold to buyers outside American borders sent an unmistakable signal to the international community about where genuine leverage actually resides in today's economy. In corporate headquarters from Tokyo to Berlin, executive boards absorbed the lesson. If Beijing can reallocate such strategically vital resources practically overnight, then the fundamental distribution of global power has already undergone a seismic shift. And as Scott Bessent continued his media tour, attempting to reassure nervous investors with promises about forming new international partnerships, China was quietly demonstrating that physical control over critical materials can prove far more potent than even the loudest political rhetoric or the most aggressive tariff threats. China's dominant position in this escalating standoff doesn't derive from diplomatic statements or propaganda campaigns. It stems from something far more concrete, unparalleled control over the physical infrastructure of global supply chains. Over the course of the past 2 decades, Beijing has systematically constructed a stranglehold over rare earth production that no competing nation can realistically challenge. Approximately 70% of the planet's rare earth mining operations are located within Chinese borders, but that's only part of the story. Nearly 90% of the refining and processing work, the sophisticated industrial procedures that transform raw ore into usable components, happens exclusively inside China. These materials aren't optional luxuries or niche products. They're fundamental to modern civilization. Fighter aircraft require rare earth elements for their avionics and targeting systems. Wind turbine generators depend on powerful permanent magnets made from these materials. Electric vehicle motors can't function without them. The smartphone in your pocket contains more than a dozen different rare earth compounds. This comprehensive dependence gives Beijing 2 extremely powerful tools it can deploy whenever geopolitical pressure intensifies. The first mechanism is supply restriction. By deliberately slowing the pace of exports, China can instantaneously drive up production costs for manufacturers throughout the American industrial base. Every precision sensor becomes more expensive to source. Every specialized magnet sees its price climb. Every advanced battery component grows scarcer. The ripple effects extend far beyond immediate cost increases. Investment decisions begin to shift. Would a Japanese semiconductor manufacturer commit billions to expanding a new fabrication facility if there's a real possibility they could lose access to affordable rare earth materials within months? Would an American drone developer move forward with a scaled production plan under similar uncertainty? This psychological dimension, the mere threat of supply disruption, can move markets and reshape corporate strategy faster than any tariff policy ever could. The second tool operates in precisely the opposite direction.
supply flooding. By releasing massive volumes of rare earth materials onto global markets at artificially suppressed prices, China possesses the capability to economically destroy their mining ventures before they can achieve commitment. Companies like MPT, currently operating one of the few significant rare earth mines in the United States, already struggle to maintain profitability, even with substantial government subsidies and protective policies. A coordinated wave of below-cost Chinese rare earths could obliterate years of capital investment and technical development in a matter of months. Beijing has demonstrated this tactic. In 2015, following a brief period of restricted exports, Chinese authorities orchestrated a deliberate oversupply campaign that caused global rare earth prices to crash by nearly 60%. Foreign competitors who had invested heavily in developing alternative sources found their business models suddenly unsustainable. Many simply shut down operations entirely. The market consolidated back into Chinese hands, exactly as Beijing's planners intended. This strategic approach doesn't require theatrical pronouncements or inflammatory rhetoric. One carefully worded statement from China's Ministry of Commerce proved sufficient to send tremors through Washington's policy establishment. If the United States persists in pursuing its current erroneous course of action, China will resolutely implement all necessary countermeasures to protect its legitimate rights and interests. That single sentence, measured and bureaucratic in tone, was enough to rattle financial markets and expose just how precarious America's position has become. The remarkable aspect is that Beijing hasn't actually deployed either lever or full force yet. Even without taking decisive action, China already has Washington reacting defensively, a clear indicator of which side genuinely controls critical pressure points in this relationship.
The coalition that nobody wants to join. Facing mounting criticism domestically and watching financial markets respond nervously to each new development, Scott Bessent attempted to pivot toward a different approach. Rather than escalating the tariff confrontation, he began advocating for what he described as a comprehensive international coalition designed to resist China's export restrictions on critical minerals. In essence, this represented a revival of Washington's long-standing Fortress America concept, though now wrapped in the contemporary language of democratic solidarity and supply chain resilience. Bessent's pitch to reporters emphasized that the United States would mobilize the G7 nations, India, Japan, and other countries sharing democratic values to present a united front against Beijing's dominance over essential raw materials. His public pronouncements projected confidence. We will not permit these restrictions to stand unchallenged. But away from the television cameras and press briefings, the reality looked dramatically different. The international support Bessent promised simply wasn't materializing. Consider Europe's position. The continent is already teetering on the edge of recession, with multiple major economies showing negative or stagnant growth. European automotive manufacturers and renewable energy companies have become deeply integrated into supply chains that depend heavily on Chinese inputs, from lithium-ion battery cells to the rare earth permanent magnets that power electric motors. Germany's electric vehicle sector alone sources more than 80% of its rare earth components directly from Chinese suppliers. Asking German automakers to suddenly sever those relationships would be tantamount to asking them to voluntarily shut down production lines. Japan and South Korea face similarly complicated circumstances. Both nations are still attempting to recover from the economic disruptions caused by American tariff policies implemented earlier in 2025. Neither government has any political appetite to voluntarily trigger another round of supply chain chaos. The business communities in Tokyo and Seoul have made their positions abundantly clear to their respective governments. We cannot afford another major disruption to our access to Chinese industrial inputs. India presents perhaps the most striking example of the gap between political rhetoric and economic reality. Despite ongoing territorial disputes with China and periodic border tensions, bilateral trade between the two Asian giants has continued expanding. In 2024, total commerce between India and China exceeded $136 billion. Chinese components remain absolutely critical for India's rapidly growing solar panel industry and its expanding electronics manufacturing sector. When Washington asks New Delhi to join an anti-China coalition on rare earth minerals, Indian policymakers understand perfectly well what that request actually means. Sacrifice your own industrial development to serve American strategic interests. So while Bessent traveled the world speaking about unity and collective action, the international community was quietly moving in the opposite direction. Washington's campaign to isolate China on this issue instead revealed America's own isolation. Other nations might offer polite statements of agreement during diplomatic meetings, but when it comes to actual implementation, to policies that would require real economic sacrifice, none of America's supposed partners are willing to damage their own industries for the sake of Washington's strategy. And as Bessent struggled to assemble meaningful international support for his coalition concept, Beijing was preparing to open an entirely new dimension of the conflict. This next move would strike directly at the foundations of American financial power itself. Following the money China's financial withdrawal. While Washington continues attempting to construct diplomatic alliances, Beijing has already been executing a sophisticated strategy on an entirely different battlefield, the financial markets. What began as a gradual, almost imperceptible reduction in Chinese engagement with American assets has now evolved into a steady and deliberate withdrawal. The transformation in Chinese investment patterns tells a remarkable story. Back in 2016, Chinese investors completed acquisitions and direct investment deals inside the United States, valued at more than $57 billion. This year, that figure has collapsed to barely $2 billion, the lowest level recorded in more than a decade. Simultaneously, China has been systematically reducing its holdings of United States Treasury securities. The mechanism varies. Sometimes Beijing sells bonds outright into secondary markets, while in other cases, Chinese authorities simply allow maturing securities to expire without purchasing replacements. According to official data released by the U.S. Treasury Department, China has reduced its position by more than $25 billion just in recent months. Each time Beijing executes one of these sales or allows bonds to mature unreplaced, bond yields rise incrementally. This pushes borrowing costs higher for the American government at precisely the moment when the Federal Reserve has been trying to ease monetary policy and bring interest rates down. America's accumulated debt load, which has now surpassed $37 trillion, becomes increasingly difficult to manage when one of the government's historically largest creditors quietly backs away from the market. Financial analysts have calculated that every $100 billion decline in foreign demand for Treasury securities adds approximately 10 to 15 basis points to long-term interest rates. While that might sound modest in isolation, the cumulative impact across a debt load measured in the tens of trillions becomes genuinely significant. This isn't panic selling driven by fear of imminent crisis. This is calculated strategy being executed with patience and precision. China is methodically disentangling itself from the dollar-denominated financial system that has dominated global finance since the end of World War II. Chinese reserve managers are converting their holdings into alternative stores of value. Physical gold reserves continue to expand, commodity stockpiles grow larger, and investment flows are redirected toward regional development projects across Asia and Africa. While American politicians debate the mechanics of tariff policy, Chinese strategists are working to reshape the fundamental architecture of international finance. The result of this shift is subtle in the short term, but devastating in its long-term implications, a steady erosion of America's financial leverage over other nations. The dollar's role as the unquestioned reserve currency of global commerce depends on continuous foreign demand for dollar-denominated assets. As that demand weakens, So too does Washington's ability to use financial pressure as a diplomatic weapon. And as American bond markets begin to shake under this mounting pressure, another set of economic statistics emerging from China will soon make Washington's strategic position look even more precarious than it already appears. The trade numbers that tell the real story. While Washington continues pointing fingers at Beijing for allegedly distorting global trade patterns, the actual data reveals a narrative that American policymakers would prefer to ignore. Chinese exports experienced a surge of 8.3% in September 2025, reaching a total value of nearly $330 billion, marking the fastest growth rate recorded in 6 months. It's true that shipments specifically destined for the United States declined by approximately 27% compared to the previous year. But here's what makes that statistic misleading. The reduction in American-bound exports was more than compensated for by explosive growth in Chinese sales to other regions. Exports flowing to Southeast Asian nations, Middle Eastern markets, and African economies jumped between 15% and 18%, propelled by the new trade corridors and transportation infrastructure that China has been constructing through its Belt and Road Initiative. Even the European Union, despite ongoing tariff disputes with Beijing, increased its imports of Chinese components, particularly the specialized parts needed for electric vehicle production and solar panel manufacturing. The evidence demonstrates that Chinese exporters have successfully diversified their customer base, rather than remaining dangerously dependent on access to the American market. At the same time, China's own imports climbed by 7.4%, which signals two important developments: stronger domestic consumer demand within China itself, and a deliberate shift toward building more regionally integrated supply chains. Beijing is purchasing increased volumes of raw materials from Brazil, Australia, and Indonesia, while simultaneously expanding manufacturing partnerships with India, Vietnam, and Malaysia. This pattern reveals a deeper structural transformation taking place in the global economy. China is evolving beyond its historical role as simply the world's factory. It's positioning itself as a comprehensive global logistics hub that connects resource suppliers with final markets, controlling both ends of the supply chain. Meanwhile, American exporters are steadily losing ground in the Chinese market. U.S. shipments to China have declined to their lowest level since 2009. Soybean exports, which once symbolized America's agricultural strength and represented one of the few bright spots in U.S.-China trade, remain near zero, Chinese buyers having successfully diversified their agricultural suppliers to include Brazil, Argentina, and other nations. As China continues expanding its network of trading partners and building more diverse supply relationships, its grip on global commerce grows progressively tighter. The trade war that American policymakers designed to isolate and economically weaken Beijing has instead accelerated China's diversification strategy. Trump built tariff walls, Beijing built relationships, and those commercial relationships are now crystallizing into powerful new trade alliances that operate increasingly outside of American influence. The geopolitical implications extend far beyond simple export statistics. The Yuan's quiet revolution. China's expanding dominance in physical trade is now fundamentally reshaping how international finance operates. An increasing number of countries are choosing to settle their commercial transactions directly in Chinese yuan rather than converting through US dollars. The transformation has been remarkably rapid. Just 5 years ago, only about 15% of China's international trade was conducted using its own currency. Today, that proportion has doubled to approximately 30%. And when examining cross-border financial flows more broadly, including foreign investment and international lending, the yuan now accounts for almost half of all transactions involving Chinese entities. This shift is accelerating as nations around the world seek to insulate themselves from the risk of American sanctions and payment system restrictions. The concern isn't purely theoretical. Countries from Iran to Russia to Venezuela have found themselves suddenly cut off from the SWIFT international payment network at Washington's direction, with devastating consequences for their economies. Governments are drawing obvious conclusions about the risks of remaining entirely dependent on dollar-based financial infrastructure that can be weaponized for political purposes. The geographic pattern of de-dollarization is especially pronounced across Asia and throughout the global South. BRICS member nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, along with newer members, are rapidly expanding their use of Yuan-based trade settlements. More than 130 countries are now connected to CEPS, China's cross-border interbank payment system, which functions as Beijing's alternative to the Western-dominated SWIFT network. The technical infrastructure for conducting international commerce without touching the dollar system now exists and is growing more sophisticated each quarter.